On a windy morning in April of 1976, Elias Turner walked into Harper County Farm Supply carrying a small notebook, a roll of twine, and a question that made every man at the counter stop talking. "You got any clover seed left?" he asked. Not feed clover for cattle pasture, not a little bag for a garden patch behind the house. He wanted enough to plant strips of it straight through his wheat fields. For a second, nobody said anything. The store smelled like diesel, dust, and chemical spray. Stacked by the front wall were metal cans of fungicide and pesticide, the things every serious farmer in Harper County had been buying for weeks. The talk that morning had been the same talk you heard everywhere that spring. Blight, moisture, fungus, rot, how bad it might get, how much stronger they might have to spray this year. And there stood Elias Turner asking for clover. Denny Rusk was the first one to laugh. He leaned against the counter, thumb hooked in his belt, and shook his head like he was looking at a man who had finally lost his senses. "Clover?" Denny said. "In wheat? Elias, you planting a crop or building a rabbit patch?" A couple of the others laughed with him. Marlowe Jenkins, who never trusted anything he hadn't seen work on 3 neighboring farms first, narrowed his eyes and asked the question everyone was already thinking. "You're not planning to spray properly this season, are you?" Elias didn't answer right away. He just set the twine and notebook on the counter and looked at the seed shelves like he already knew exactly what he came for. "Not the way you boys mean it," he said calmly. That was the moment the room changed. Because outside, across thousands of acres, the first signs of blight were already creeping into the county, and the one farmer they were all about to laugh at was the only one who had seen it coming. If you've ever had an idea people laughed at, you'll understand this story. Would you stick to your method or follow the crowd? Subscribe for more real stories like this. Elias Turner was not the kind of man people expected to take risks. He was 48 years old in the spring of 1976, and he had been farming the same 520 acres his father left him since he came back from overseas in the early 50s. He wasn't known as a talker, and he wasn't known as a dreamer. If anything, people in Harper County described him as steady, predictable, the kind of farmer who fixed his own equipment, paid his bills on time, and didn't go looking for attention. For more than 20 years, Elias had done things the same way everyone else did. Plant on schedule, fertilize heavy, spray early, spray again if needed, protect the yield at all costs. That was modern farming, and in Harper County, modern farming meant one thing above all else: control. You controlled weeds with chemicals, you controlled insects with chemicals, and if something threatened your crop, you didn't wait to understand it, you sprayed it. Most of the farmers around Elias had built their entire operations around that belief. Denny Rusk farmed nearly 1,000 acres just north of the highway and prided himself on being first to adopt anything new that promised higher yields. His equipment was newer, bigger, faster than anyone else's. If there was a stronger chemical available, Denny was already using it. Marlowe Jenkins was different. Older, careful. He didn't trust trends, but he trusted results. If something worked for 3 seasons in a row, he would adopt it without hesitation. Until then, he stuck with what had always worked. And then there was Curtis Bell, who spent more time at the co-op than in his own fields, always talking numbers, margins, input costs, trying to squeeze a little more profit out of every acre. They were different men, but they all believed the same thing. If something threatened your crop, you fought it harder. That spring, the threat had a name everyone was starting to whisper more often: blight. It had shown up early in nearby counties. Reports were coming in of weakened plants, spreading patches, fields turning uneven weeks before they should have. The Extension Office had already issued warnings. Conditions were right for it to spread fast, which meant one thing: spray earlier, spray stronger, don't take chances. Everyone in Harper County was preparing for a fight. Everyone except Elias Turner. because while the others were watching the weather reports and waiting for instructions, Elias had been watching something else entirely. It started 3 years earlier, in the late spring of 1973, on a morning that didn't look any different from any other. Elias had been walking his south field just after sunrise, checking moisture and plant height before the heat settled in. The wheat should have been even, clean rows, consistent growth. That's what years of proper spraying and fertilizing were supposed to give you. But halfway down the field, something didn't match. There was a strip along the fence line where the wheat looked stronger. Not taller, not dramatically different, but steadier. The color was deeper. The leaves looked fuller, and when Elias knelt down and ran his fingers along the stalks, they felt thicker, more alive than the rest of the field. He frowned and looked around. That section hadn't been treated the same. He remembered it clearly. A week earlier, the sprayer had jammed near that fence. By the time he fixed it, he'd skipped that narrow strip, telling himself he'd come back to it later. He never had. Now he was standing in the only part of his field that had been left alone, and it was doing better. Elias didn't jump to conclusions. He wasn't the kind of man to build theories on one observation, but he didn't ignore it either. He walked deeper into the field. The rest of the wheat looked normal for the season, maybe even good by most standards, but compared to that untreated strip, it felt dependent, like it needed constant help to stay that way. Elias went back to the fence line and studied it again. The soil looked slightly different. There were small plants growing low between the wheat rows, clover, grasses, things he would normally consider competition, things he would normally eliminate without a second thought. He crouched there longer than he intended to, because for the first time in over 20 years of farming, a quiet thought crossed his mind. What if removing everything wasn't actually helping? He didn't say it out loud. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. But that morning, standing in a strip of wheat he had accidentally left untouched, Elias Turner began to question the one rule every farmer around him had built their life on. Elias didn't change everything at once. That wasn't his way. The next season, 1974, he made a small adjustment. Small enough that most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. Along the edges of his fields and in a few narrow passes through the middle, he left strips untreated. No full spray, no complete clearing, just controlled sections where he allowed low-growing plants, clover, native grasses, whatever came up naturally, to stay. To Elias, it was an experiment. To everyone else, it looked like neglect. The first comments came early, before the wheat had even fully established. "You miss a pass out there?" Curtis Bell asked one morning at the co-op, half smiling as he stirred his coffee. Elias shook his head. "No." Curtis raised an eyebrow. "Looks like it." Elias didn't explain. By mid-season, the strips were visible even from the road. Thin green ribbons cutting through otherwise clean, uniform wheat. They didn't look like crops. They looked like mistakes. Denny Rusk noticed next. He pulled his truck over one afternoon, leaned against the door, and stared out across Elias's land like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "What exactly am I looking at here?" he called out when Elias drove up from the far side of the field. "Just leaving some space," Elias said. "For what?" Elias paused. "To see what happens." Denny let out a short laugh. "What happens is you lose yield. That's what happens." Word started to spread. At the coffee shop, the story grew with every telling. "Turner's letting weeds grow on purpose now. He's cutting back on spraying. He's trying some kind of old-school farming nonsense." The tone wasn't angry, not yet. It was amusement, the kind of quiet, confident amusement that comes from knowing you're right and watching someone else drift off course. By harvest, the differences were noticeable, but not dramatic. Elias's yields came in slightly lower than the top farms in the county. Not a disaster, not a failure, but enough to confirm what everyone already believed. "See," Marlowe Jenkins said, folding his yield report at the grain elevator. "You don't stay clean, you don't stay competitive." No one argued with him. Elias didn't argue either. He stood there, listening, nodding when appropriate, saying very little. On paper, they were right. The numbers didn't lie. But Elias had been tracking something else. He had walked his fields every morning that summer, just like he always did. He had knelt down in those untreated strips, watching closely, not just the wheat, but everything around it. And what he saw there didn't match what the others were seeing from the road. He saw patterns forming. Small ones, easy to miss, easy to dismiss, but they were there. And for the first time, Elias wasn't measuring success by what he harvested at the end of the season. He was measuring what was changing underneath it. While the rest of Harper County looked at his fields and saw mistakes, Elias Turner was starting to see a system. By the spring of 1975, the pressure wasn't coming from jokes anymore. It was coming from numbers. Fuel costs had gone up again. Chemical prices followed right behind. Every trip to the co-op felt heavier than the last, receipts stacking up faster than most farmers wanted to admit out loud. But the thinking hadn't changed. If the threat gets worse, you respond harder. That was the rule. So when early reports of blight started coming in stronger than the year before, Harper County didn't hesitate. Farmers sprayed sooner, mixed stronger, covered more ground in less time. You could hear the rigs running from before sunrise until well after dark, engines humming across the fields like a warning that no one wanted to ignore. Elias Turner did something different. Again. He expanded his untreated strips. Not dramatically, not enough to draw attention from a distance, but enough that if you stood in his field, you could see the pattern clearly now. Structured lines of clover and low growth weaving through the wheat, not random anymore, intentional. Curtis Bell noticed first. "You're doubling down on that?" he asked, looking out over the field with a frown that wasn't amused anymore. Elias nodded. "Learning from last year." Curtis shook his head slowly. "Last year proved it doesn't work." Elias didn't respond, because from Curtis's point of view, that was true. But Elias wasn't looking at the same scoreboard. That season, the differences started showing earlier. Not in yield, not yet. In behavior. While other farmers began reporting early signs of stress, uneven patches, weakened growth, sections that didn't respond the way they used to after spraying, Elias noticed something else entirely: stability. His fields weren't perfect, they weren't untouched, but they weren't reacting the same way either. Where others saw sudden shifts, Elias saw gradual change. Where others saw problems spreading, Elias saw them slowing. He couldn't explain it fully, not yet, but he trusted what he was seeing. The community didn't. At the coffee shop, the tone had shifted from humor to concern. "He's going to hurt himself doing this," someone said one morning. "He's already behind," another added. "He just doesn't want to admit it." Denny Rusk was more direct. "You keep playing around like this," he told Elias one afternoon, "and one bad season is all it's going to take. You won't recover from it." It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said like a warning. Because in Harper County, failure didn't stay small. One weak harvest could ripple into loans, into equipment, into land itself. And Elias was getting closer to that edge with every season he refused to follow the system everyone else trusted. But still, he didn't change course. He kept walking his fields, kept watching, kept adjusting small things no one else noticed. Because beneath the surface, beneath the numbers, beneath the criticism, something was building, something quiet, something slow. And whatever it was, it hadn't shown its full strength yet. That summer tested Elias more than any season before it. Not because his fields were failing, but because they weren't proving him right fast enough. Every morning he walked the same paths he'd been walking for years, down the fence lines, through the strips he had left untouched, into the middle of the wheat where everything was supposed to be uniform and predictable. But nothing felt certain anymore. He could see the differences, subtle but real, places where the crop held steady instead of weakening, areas that didn't react the same way as the rest of the county. And still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. At the grain elevator, the conversations had changed. No more jokes, no more easy laughter. Now it was quiet looks, measured questions. How's your yield shaping up this year? You planning to adjust next season? People weren't mocking him anymore. They were waiting for him to fail. And that was heavier. At night, Elias sat at the kitchen table with his notes spread out in front of him, pages filled with observations no one else cared about, patterns that didn't translate cleanly into numbers, small signs that felt important but didn't yet prove anything. Helen watched him from across the room. "You don't have to keep pushing it," she said one evening, gently. "No one would blame you for going back to what works." Elias didn't answer right away, because that was the problem. What worked was exactly what he was starting to question. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the notes, then out toward the dark fields beyond the window. For 20 years he had followed the same system as everyone else, and for 20 years it had made sense. But now he had seen something different, something he couldn't unsee, even if it hadn't fully proven itself yet. He exhaled slowly and closed the notebook. "I just need one more season," he said quietly. Not to convince anyone else, just to find out if he was wrong. By the start of the next season, things finally began to look like they were turning in Elias's favor. The early growth came in clean, even, steady, strong in a way that didn't draw attention from the road, but stood out to anyone who walked the rows. The untreated strips had filled in naturally over the winter, clover thicker now, ground cover more consistent, holding moisture better than he'd expected. For the first time, Elias felt something close to confirmation. Not certainty, but direction. When the first minor signs of disease showed up in nearby counties, his fields didn't react the same way. While others started talking about early patches and preventative sprays, Elias saw something different. Slower spread, weaker symptoms, areas that seemed to hold their ground instead of collapsing. At the co-op, the tone had shifted again. Not respect, not yet, but hesitation. "You noticing anything strange this year?" Curtis Bell asked one morning, trying to sound casual. Elias nodded slightly. "A little." Curtis studied him for a second, like he wanted to ask more, but didn't. Even Denny Rusk had stopped making jokes. He drove past Elias's land twice that week. Didn't stop, but he looked. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias wasn't the only one watching his fields closely. By mid-season, the gap seemed to widen. Where others were already scheduling second sprays, Elias held off. His crops stayed steady. The structure he'd been building, quietly, season after season, looked like it was finally doing something real. That evening, walking through the center of his largest field, Elias slowed his steps and looked out across the rows. The wind moved through the wheat evenly. No sudden breaks, no obvious weakness. He stood there longer than usual, because for the first time since all of this had started, it felt like he had been right all along. And if things kept going this way, he wouldn't just survive this season, he'd prove every one of them wrong. The change didn't come all at once. At first, it was just a few reports drifting in from the western edge of the county, fields that had already been sprayed, showing signs of infection anyway. Nothing dramatic, not yet. Just patches that didn't respond the way they were supposed to. Farmers brushed it off at first. Adjust the mix, spray again, hit it earlier next time. That had always worked before. But this time, it didn't hold. Within 2 weeks, the tone across Harper County shifted. The co-op got busier. Trucks lined up before sunrise. Orders doubled, then doubled again. Stronger combinations, higher doses. People talking faster, louder, like if they moved quick enough they could stay ahead of whatever was coming. Elias watched it happen without saying much. From the road, his field still looked steady. From the outside, it seemed like he had escaped the worst of it. But when he walked deeper into the rows, he saw something that stopped him cold. It was there. Small, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. The same early signs. Weak spots forming along the lower leaves, a slight dullness where the color should have been strong. Not spreading fast, but present. Elias crouched down and ran his fingers across the stalk. For a long moment he didn't move. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not now. Not after everything he had changed. Behind him, across the county, the problem was growing. And for the first time since this all began, Elias couldn't tell if his system was about to prove itself or collapse with everything else. By mid-June, Harper County stopped pretending it was a normal season. The blight moved faster than anyone had seen before. Fields that had been sprayed early were showing damage anyway. Fields that had been sprayed twice were already weakening. Farmers who had followed every recommendation, every schedule, every precaution were watching their crops slip out of control. The co-op ran out of supply twice in 1 week. Tankers came in from 2 counties over. New chemical mixes were suggested. Old ones were doubled. Labels were pushed past what they recommended. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. If this didn't stop soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. Denny Rusk sprayed 3 times in 14 days. Curtis Bell started before sunrise and ran until dark, covering every acre like he was trying to outrun something he couldn't see. Marlowe Jenkins, the most careful of them all, broke his own rule and used combinations he had never trusted before. And still, the blight kept spreading. It didn't crash in all at once. It crept, row by row, patch by patch. Leaves lost their strength. Color faded unevenly. Growth slowed, then stalled. From the road, the fields still looked intact, but up close the damage was already written into them. By early July, the county extension office stopped giving clear answers. Do what you can, was all they had left to say. Elias Turner didn't spray again, not because he was certain, but because by that point he understood something the others didn't. He had been watching their fields too, and what he saw there didn't look like a fight being won. It looked like something being chased. Every time they sprayed, the response came back weaker, shorter, less effective than the time before. The problem wasn't disappearing. It was adjusting, changing shape. Elias had seen enough, so he walked his own fields, not from the road, from inside, at sunrise, at dusk. And what he found there was different. The early signs he had seen weeks before hadn't spread. They were still there, but they hadn't taken over. They had stalled. In some places, they had even pulled back. Elias didn't rush to conclusions. He didn't assume anything. He just kept looking. He crouched near one of the untreated strips running through the center of his field and stayed there longer than usual, watching closely. That's when he noticed it. Not the wheat. What was moving through it. Small, constant movement just below the surface of the leaves. Tiny patterns easy to miss unless you stayed still long enough for your eyes to adjust. Life. Not the kind most farmers paid attention to. The kind they usually tried to remove. Elias leaned in closer. What he saw wasn't damage spreading. It was pressure pushing back. Where the signs of blight appeared, they didn't expand the way they did in other fields. They held. They slowed. Something was interrupting the process, not eliminating it, but keeping it from taking over. The difference wasn't dramatic from a distance, but inside the field it was undeniable. His system wasn't preventing the problem, it was containing it, and that changed everything. By late July, the contrast across Harper County became impossible to ignore. From the highway, you could see it clearly. Fields that should have been uniform were breaking apart into uneven sections. Growth was inconsistent. Large areas had already lost their strength entirely. And in the middle of it, Elias Turner's land still stood, not untouched, not perfect, but stable. Where others were reacting, he had something that could absorb the pressure. Where others were fighting the problem directly, he had built something that kept it from taking control. People started slowing down when they drove past his fields, not out of curiosity anymore, out of confusion, because whatever they had been doing wasn't working.
And whatever Elias Turner had been building for the last 3 years finally was.
The first person who crossed the line wasn't the one anyone expected. It was Marlowe Jenkins. For years, Marlowe had been the steady one, the cautious one, the man who never changed direction without proof, stacked 3 seasons deep. If something worked, he adopted it. If it didn't, he ignored it. He wasn't the kind of man who went looking for answers on someone else's land. But by the last week of July, caution didn't mean much anymore. He parked his truck along the dirt road that split his property from Elias Turner's and sat there for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. On his side, the wheat had broken. From a distance, it still held its shape, but up close, it was finished. The heads were light, the color uneven, the strength gone from the stalks. Weeks of spraying had slowed the damage in places, but never stopped it, not once. He had done everything right, and it hadn't been enough. Across the road, Elias's field stood differently. Not perfect, not untouched, but steady in a way that didn't make sense anymore. Marlowe stepped out of the truck, closed the door quietly, and walked toward the fence. He didn't call out, didn't announce himself. He just climbed through. The difference hit him before he made it 10 steps in, not in what he saw first, but in what he didn't. There was no sudden collapse, no spreading weakness, no feeling that the field was slipping out of control. He walked deeper, slower now, scanning everything like a man trying to find the thing he had missed. He stopped, crouched down, and pulled a stalk closer. There were signs of the same pressure he had seen in his own fields, but here it hadn't taken over. He moved further in, another section, same pattern. Not gone, but held. Marlowe stood up slowly and turned in a slow circle, taking in the entire field. The untreated strips ran through it like quiet lines of structure, not random, not messy, intentional, connected. He didn't fully understand what he was looking at, but he understood one thing clearly. This wasn't luck. Behind him, a truck door slammed, then another. By the time Marlowe turned back toward the road, he wasn't alone anymore. Denny Rusk had pulled up first, Curtis Bell right behind him, and then 2 more trucks, then another. Word had traveled faster than anyone realized. One by one, they crossed over. No one joked. No one made comments. They walked the field the same way Marlowe had, quiet, careful, trying to see what they had missed all season. Elias saw them from the far side of the field. He didn't hurry. He didn't wave. He just walked toward them at the same steady pace he always had. By the time he reached them, they were already scattered through the rows, each man crouching, standing, moving again, searching for something they couldn't name yet. Denny was the first to speak. "What is this?" he said, not looking up. It wasn't a challenge, it was a question. Elias stopped a few steps away. "Same field as yours," he said. Denny shook his head slowly. "No, it's not." Curtis stood up next, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You didn't spray again." It wasn't really a question either. Elias nodded once. A long silence followed, the kind that doesn't come from nothing to say, but from too much to process at once. Finally, Marlowe stepped closer. "I walked this whole section," he said quietly. "It's there, but it's not spreading." Elias looked at him, then out across the field. "No, it's not." Denny straightened up, frustration breaking through. "That's not possible," he said. "It's hitting every field in the county. We've done everything we're supposed to do." Elias didn't argue, didn't correct him. He just said the one thing none of them had been able to admit yet. Maybe that's the problem. That was the moment everything shifted. Not when they saw the difference, but when they realized they didn't understand it, and the one man they had spent 3 years dismissing was the only one who did.
The change didn't happen overnight, but it started that same week. For the first time in years, Harper County wasn't arguing about what to spray. They were asking a different question. What did you do? Elias didn't hold anything back. That evening, a handful of them came to his place, not a meeting, not official, just trucks parked along the dirt road, men standing on his porch, hats in their hands like they were stepping into something unfamiliar. He brought out his notebook. Not numbers, not yield charts, observations. Where he had left strips untouched, what had changed over time, what he had seen, not just in the crop, but around it. They listened, really listened. For the first time, no one interrupted, no one argued, because they had already seen the difference with their own eyes. Over the next few days, more came, then more. Word spread the way it always did in small places, quiet at first, then all at once. By early August, half the county had walked Elias Turner's fields. Not to criticize, to understand. And slowly, the shift began. Not everyone changed at once. Some couldn't. They had already pushed too far into the season, too much damage done, too much loss to recover in time. But others started making small adjustments, leaving sections untreated, reducing sprays, watching more, reacting less. It didn't fix everything, not that year, but it changed the direction. And when harvest came, the numbers told a story no one could ignore. Across Harper County, yields dropped hard. Fields that had looked strong in May barely made it through August. Costs were higher than anyone had planned for. Some farms didn't break even. Some didn't recover at all. But Elias Turner's harvest came in steady. Not record-breaking, not perfect, but intact. Where others had fought the problem and lost, he had absorbed it. And that made all the difference. At the grain elevator, the conversations were quieter than usual. No boasting, no comparisons, just numbers being handed over, weights being measured, receipts printed without much conversation. Elias stood in line like he always did. Same truck, same load. Nothing about him had changed, but the way people looked at him had. Denny Rusk was there that morning. He didn't speak right away, just watched as Elias finished unloading and stepped back from the scale. Then, finally, "You figured something out," Denny said. It wasn't said with pride or resentment, just honesty. Elias wiped his hands on a rag and shrugged slightly. "I paid attention," he said. Denny nodded once. Didn't argue, didn't push. Because for the first time, there wasn't anything left to challenge. Marlo Jenkins stepped forward next. "You're going to show us how to do it right?" he asked. Elias looked between them. The same men who had questioned him, warned him, waited for him to fail. He could have said a lot in that moment, reminded them of the conversations, the doubts, the way they had looked at him when he first made the change. But he didn't. He just nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I will." And just like that, the man they had spent years dismissing became the one they followed.
The next few seasons didn't fix everything overnight, but they changed the way Harper County farmed. Fields began to look different, not perfectly clean like before, but balanced. Strips of clover and low growth started appearing where bare soil used to be. Sprayers didn't run as often, and when they did, it was with more thought, not just reaction. Some farmers never made the shift. Some couldn't recover from that year. But the ones who stayed learned. Not from a textbook, from a man who had been willing to look wrong long enough to figure something out. Elias Turner never called it a system, never gave it a name. He just kept doing what worked. Years later, people would talk about that season like it was a turning point, not because of the blight, but because of what it revealed. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing everyone told you to stop doing.